Hey Al, Craig. Still hot in South Carolina and still dealing with masks and all this COVID-19 stuff. So I thought, hey, it'd be a whole lot of fun to make a timeline so we could see what has happened, ever since this thing started way back in November. November. Let me go through this timeline. This is it's kind of crazy how all this stuff has developed. November 17th, a 55-year-old man in Wuhan was maybe the first guy to have this virus hit him. No one knew what it was at the time. And it wasn't until December 1st that they actually had a 70-year-old man, a stroke patient, as the first documented case. This is the first guy that they said, okay, we've really got to look at this and find out what in the world this is. We haven't seen this before. But looking back, now they know that probably this fellow, this 55-year-old guy on the November 17th was the first guy to actually come down with the virus. At the end of the month, December 30th, a couple of doctors, maybe more than a few, got together on a WeChat conversation to talk about this new virus that they've suddenly stumbled across, and patients exhibiting really unusual symptoms, and they were very concerned that they had a new virus starting to break out. Not an unusual thing in China. On December 31st, they notified the World Health Organization, the WHO. But on January 1st, the Chinese authorities directed them to destroy the samples and stop testing. On the next day, January 2nd, a virology lab there in Wuhan actually obtained the genome. They had figured out what the genome was of the virus. So again, that's an important date to keep in mind. That was January 2nd. They knew what this was. January 5th, the Taiwanese started to monitor people coming in from China. They had caught wind that there might be a virus sparking up, and again, this wasn't terribly unusual in that part of the world. And Taiwan's very careful about this kind of thing, and so they started to crack down right away. They started to take temperatures and quarantine people that showed symptoms of any sickness. They just basically, anybody coming in there, they took a very careful look at. They got very serious right away. Right away. Most of the world hadn't heard of this, obviously, at this point. A little before that, January 3rd, one of the doctors that was on that call, Dr. Wenliang, and I'm sure I've mispronounced his name, and I'm sorry, Dr. Lee, but he was called in to talk to the authorities, and by the 7th, he died by the virus, evidently. The other doctor disappeared, I believe. It's risky being anything in China, I believe. January 9th, the WHO had basically suggested that, hey, once Taiwan started their restrictions, hey, no, there's no need. There's nothing to see here. So this was, they were notified the 31st of December, right? And by the 9th, they were saying, no, nothing to worry about. January 11th, China decided to go ahead and share the genome information with the World Health Organization. Okay, so they had it on the 2nd, but they shared it on the 11th, which was a weekend. They put it out there, and by January 13th, which was a Monday, a company named Moderna among others. But Moderna started working on trying to figure out how to manufacture a vaccine. The way it's done now is very different. They design this on a computer and coax it out, in labs. Whereas it was a much more time-consuming process in the past. But Moderna had started about then, and they're important later on because they become the first to have a vaccine as far as the people that we know of. January 13th, all right? Now, right about this time is the start of the Chinese New Year. It's the year of the steel rat. And a lot of people fly in to China to celebrate. It's a big holiday there. And so people, of course, work all over the world, because China's international concern. I mean, huge, competitor with the U.S. So they've got people all over the place. So these people fly back in. So that's starting to go on right now. And again, remember, China knows they have something here, but they're not saying anything, right? The WHO said, no, there's nothing really to see here. But, they knew. But anyway, the Chinese New Year is going on. And on the 20th, January 20th, the Chinese authorities confirmed that there was a virus and that it could spread human to human. Now, it's a pretty good guess that they understood that clearly way before that. I mean, they'd already discovered the genome, they knew how this thing worked way before that. But now the New Year's over, and everybody has traveled back off to wherever they work throughout the world. And shortly after that, we start to see cases pop up everywhere, all around the world. Actually, the first case in the U.S. Was January 21st. It was a fellow that came in from Wuhan. January 23rd, Wuhan shut down the city. Okay? So everyone had pretty much left. They figure out that by the time they shut down Wuhan, over 5 million people had traveled out of Wuhan. All over the world, all throughout wherever they go, throughout China also. But people just leaving that city. Okay? Again, looking at what Taiwan did and shutting things down quickly, we know now, looking back, they got over this thing super quick. They barely had any fatalities at all. That would have been the right thing to do. Imagine if they had done that in Wuhan and shut things down before the celebration of the New Year and got really serious. This never would have gone anywhere. January 29th, President Donald Trump announced the special task force to look into what to do about this virus. January 31st, President Trump announced the first travel restrictions. Remember, he's called a xenophobe, I believe, for that. But they started shutting down travel coming from China. And, the thing is, in China, they shut down travel inside of China way before they ever shut down travel going out of China. So they certainly realized that this is a serious situation, but well before they told the rest of the world about it. At the same time, right about the time that happened, Janssen, which is part of Johnson & Johnson, their drug arm, had reached an agreement to start to produce a vaccine. February 5th, going into February now, that's when the Diamond Princess, remember that cruise ship, was quarantined. You remember seeing it go under the Golden Gate Bridge and all. Imagine. I remember thinking that, man, these cruise ships, this seems to happen all the time, and what a rotten deal. You're on vacation and everyone's sick and it's just nasty. And a lot of times they're stuck out there for a long time. And, actually, I don't know if it's still the case, but I know of a month ago, there were ships stuck at different docks around the world. The crew basically stuck on the ship, not allowed to go anywhere. And these poor guys, I mean, obviously not eating at the all-you-can-eat buffet, none of the entertainment. I mean, they're just stuck on a big stinking ship. Ugh. The Diamond Princess, February 5th. Golly, that seems like a million years ago now. February 7th. Remember Moderna I was talking about, where they got their genome, oh gosh, it was back, it was what, late January, mid-January. Anyway, February 7th, they had the vaccine. That's where you start, kind of. I mean, once you've identified it, then you have to go through 2 weeks of sterile testing. Make sure there's no other outside influence. And it always takes 2 weeks, so you don't really have something until it clears. But that's when they basically sent the product off to be tested. It's amazing how quickly they can come up with that. February 11th. The World Health Organization decides to rename this thing because, of course, everyone had come up with names, the Hong Kong flu and, the Chinese virus, and, there's certainly more colorful ones. But they named it COVID-19, so as not to hurt anybody's feelings. Yay. February 26th. Just about the end of February, was the first local transmission in the U.S. Not from somebody that came from Wuhan, but actually somebody that hadn't been around anybody that had been traveling and ended up with the virus. So we knew it was here at that point, February 26th. February 29th, the World Health Organization recommended against travel restrictions. And the first death in the U.S. was reported. Same day. And as a matter of fact, later on they figured out that a guy in California who died February 6th was probably the first. But, it takes a while to kind of gather all the information up. But from where we're at now is somebody in California on February 6th. But the first one that we knew of was February 29th as the calendar was rolling along. Now, getting into March. March 2nd was a big meeting, a bunch of the big drug makers meeting there at the White House to talk about, they've already started to discover vaccines. They're going through the testing. So now they're meeting to figure out, hey, how much of this stuff can we make? Obviously we're not going to make it in China. What can we do domestically? So that at this point they're already starting to plan up. Again, we're talking in March, early March. March 8th, our buddy Dr. Fauci made the no mask comments on 60 Minutes, March 8th. And I guess understandably, what they say is at the time, well, we need to reserve the masks for, people that work in the hospitals, which is, legitimate, right? But at that time, people felt like wearing a mask was, it's something in a sterile environment like an operating room, it makes sense. And when you're operating on somebody, you're standing over them, just to keep any spit droplets or anything while you're talking, from falling into your patient. That's good, right? But people have known about the effectiveness of masks for a long time. I mean, it's teeny bit effective. I'll get into the mask thing later. Everyone has heard that up and down. But anyway, that was March 8th that Fauci said, you don't need to worry about masks. March 13th, President Trump declared a national emergency and pledged $50 billion to help start fight this virus. March 13th. March 15th, the CDC warned against large gatherings. Beware of the Ides of March. I remember we were playing a little gig, which, oddly enough, I'll be playing at the same place tomorrow. I had a car show next to a restaurant here in town, and we'd been hearing about restrictions and concerns and all that, and I remember that was sort of like, well, we're going to have a bunch of rules. We just couldn't believe it was happening. March 15th, March 16th, they started trials on the vaccine that Moderna had come up with out in Seattle. There's three phases. Currently, there's what they call preclinical, which is before the phases. Right now, there's 142 preclinical vaccines. There are 23 in phase 1, 14 in phase 2, and 8 in phase 3. We don't have any approved yet, but I mean that's moving right along. And you can see how quickly they were on this stuff. It's just absolutely amazing. And also March 16th is when Professor Neil Ferguson, the numbers guy, right, walks in to talk to, I guess, the British Parliament or whoever they have as their league of folks concerned about national health. And he scared the hell out of Boris Johnson and all those guys. He felt, after running his models, that there could be as many as 2 million deaths in the U.S. and 500,000 in the U.K. Really scary numbers. The thing about this fella is that in the past, he's been wildly wrong. I mean, just, the same deal. Numbers, huge numbers that resulted really in much smaller numbers. But people keep listening to the guy for whatever reason, and this really caught the attention of everybody. They started taking this really serious at that point. They're like, holy smokes, we're really dealing with something we've never seen before. And the very next day, March 17th, China started their phase 1 drug test. So you can see they're pretty close to where we are, right? And they had that genome information at least a week ahead of time. I mean, you can see what a difference a week makes at this point, right? And then March 18th, our Secretary of State Pompeo pointed out that China has been covering up a lot of information, and we've seen it. We've seen how, oh no, it couldn't have come from here. Maybe it was the U.S. and it came out of this meat market and some weird tainted piece of meat, and they're just even still. They just refuse to admit that that's where it came from, and that they stayed quiet about it the whole time. But, you start to see the evidence pile up really, really quick. It is what it is. It came from where it came from. We again, November 17th, we can trace it all the way back to this 55-year-old fella, So, the next day, March 19th, was the first stay-at-home order issued in California. California was the first to shut things down at that point. And that's also the same day that President Trump had started to tout the hydroxychloroquine. And that's become very controversial. And that's an odd thing, because it's been used all around the world. The reason we use it at all, and it's an anti-malarial drug, right? It doesn't make sense with the virus. But what they found is that people who were using that drug for malaria and other reasons weren't getting the virus. It started to spread in Africa as soon as it spread anywhere else. China's got a lot of projects going in Africa, and they're just noticing, hey, these people aren't getting it, and it just they extrapolated this. Hey, wow, maybe this works, and so they've been using it all around the world ever since they figured that out. I mean, why wouldn't you, right? I mean, hey, maybe this will work, because we don't have a vaccine, so let's see things that'll work, and even if we don't know why it works, if it seems to work, let's use it. And that's what President Trump was going off of, is that information. It was worldwide at that point. And we've come up with, there's a handful of other drugs that we've found that aren't really typically used like this, right? And like the inhaler drug, the steroid for asthma. There's a few of those that can really be a lot of relief to somebody farther along that's really in bad shape as far as breathing ability. But the hydroxychloroquine works really well if you take it early on, along with zinc or a Z-Pack, or there's different drug cocktails. Vitamin D, really important. This is all stuff that doesn't cost much and is off patent. In other words, it's basically like a generic drug. And so people aren't making a mountain of money off of it because it's been around for a long time. And when they tell you it's dangerous, you have to laugh because, well, it's so dangerous that we've been using it for 40 years. It's ridiculous. But anyway, I'm getting off of my timeline here. March 27th, Trump signed a $2 trillion stimulus bill. $2 trillion. I mean, holy cow, that's a lot of money. And that's also the same day that Boris Johnson, Prime Minister of England, tests positive for the COVID. And you might guess what he used to help get better. A lot of people. Anyway, March 30th, the end of March, the FDA authorized the use of hydroxychloroquine. So yeah, go ahead, try it out. So we're all hunky-dory with it back there at the end of March. Interestingly, the April 1st, there was a Washington study, Washington State, and they had guesstimated through their models that we would probably peak somewhere in April, somewhere in the middle of April, peak deaths. And, that's what happened. April 11th was when our peak was. It's very interesting to see on the CDC's excessive deaths graph where we are today. Actually, I'll show that right here. Let's see. That was from the 22nd, that last bar. We're below the line. That should tell you something. Anyway, back to the timeline. April 2nd, we had reached 1 million global cases. And that's about the time they started to push using the mask. Like I mentioned earlier, the criticism of the mask is legitimate because there's no testing to show that it's particularly effective. If you're not really careful about touching it, it's almost going to make matters worse for you and the people around you. And everyone has to touch it because the dang things are in your way all the time. They're awful. But that's, oddly enough, it took us that long when the world reaches 1 million cases. And, they say probably the thing about the mask that really makes the difference is that it's a reminder. It's a reminder for you to be afraid of this virus. And I don't know if anyone needs a reminder at this point, but the idea is distancing and things of that nature, clean hands, that's all good stuff. And that's stuff that we've known for a long time. But taking it further and all, I think maybe to help you, be more aware that this is more serious than the normal bug that comes around. But honestly, well, I keep going down that path. I'm sorry. April 6th, we started phase 1 of the Moderna drug studies, and their stock went up out of sight. And the fellow that owns Moderna, who's been in the drug business for a while, but Moderna's kind of a newer company, he became a billionaire overnight. This is serious. I mean, you saw, $2 trillion, started with a $50 billion investment to do basic research, and then $2 trillion. Now, obviously, a lot of that goes to help people get by. Economy-wise, this has been a hell of a hit. But a lot of that money is going to go to a bunch of different drug companies to develop, these vaccines and things of this nature. This Operation Warp Speed is is going to use money up at warp speed. I promise you that. And of course, now we've got Pelosi out there, or Hatter out there, trying to get another $3 trillion. Like, oh, it's just another trillion. It's like, any idea how long it takes to pay back $1 trillion? And we haven't even started paying back on the 26 trillion we're up to, thanks to Bush and Obama and all our spending so far. It's been nuts. Back to the timeline. April 7th, Donald Trump pointed out the hypocrisy of the WHO and how they are toadies to China. And I'm so glad that we started to cut them out of the picture. They've been such a menace. And it's headed up by a fellow that doesn't know the medical field at all. I mean, the guy's just as crooked as they can be. Like the whole UN, the whole mess. It's been taken over by China for ages. China puts no money into it. We finance practically the whole thing, but yet they don't listen to us. They're just a bunch of globalists that hate us, basically. They don't adhere to any of the principles they were supposed to adhere to. It's a waste, unfortunately. It's going to have to be reworked. But I'm glad we're getting away from the WHO because, as you can see through the timeline, they weren't giving good advice at all. And it's interesting to note that they decided to finally, we should probably go down to Wuhan and just investigate matters. And when they did, behold, Wuhan was flooded because China decided to open up the floodgates on their huge Three Gorges Dam a little early because they're expecting a really bad rainy season. So they just opened up the gates and flooded the hell out of Wuhan and a bunch of the towns downstream from the dam. Convenient timing. Interestingly, though, they did end up having just one of the worst flood seasons they've ever had. I mean, this has been like just a deluge. I think they're on their 5th or 6th wave. There's been concerns that huge dam might even break, but it hasn't. But they have had to blow the walls out of a lot of the smaller dams and stuff. It's horrible. China's in really, really bad, serious shape. I don't know where they're going to get food from. I don't know who's going to sell them food because, they've lost a lot of crops this year. It's been horrific in China. Back to the timeline. Right after that, April 8th, we start to hear the first criticism of the hydroxychloroquine. All of a sudden, it's like, whoa, no, this isn't nearly as good as what Trump says it is. And, there's got to be something more sensible. It's like, well, it's weird because everyone's using it all around the world. So, we're starting to find these studies that suggest that it's not nearly as effective. Now we look back at some of these studies and we see that they were doing everything they could to make sure that the drug failed. They were either using too small a dose or too big of a dose or using it too late. People understood at this point how best to use it. They've been using it now for a few months. And, to some success. Enough success to make it worthwhile, Wonder why. April 11th, as I mentioned earlier, was the peak of deaths. That's here in the U.S. But that's sort of the good news, right? We knew we had to flatten the curve, and that was the very height of the curve. So, moving forward, April 24th, we canceled our gain of function studies. What's that? Well, that's the beeper, Craig. Trying to keep myself on track here. Gain of function is where you're basically trying to coax a new virus out of some kind of creature that is hosting a virus that we haven't had yet. So, bats, as an example, carry all kinds of viruses that we don't catch. But there have been viruses that bats carry that are close to viruses we could catch. And so, as an example, bats have been studied for a while. And coincidentally, one of the labs that did a lot of bat studies was right there in Wuhan, China. And we, among others, had invested money in that lab, but we had invested money all over the place. Dr. Fauci actually headed up a group of studies that were concerned in this gain of function practice, where labs would basically coax these viruses to a point where it would infect humans. The idea, of course, is to keep it all controlled and contained. And so once you bring this virus out to the point where it can contaminate people, then you figure out how to make the vaccine. So if this virus suddenly pops up, you've already got a vaccine that would lend itself to it. We've got all kinds of components. We've been using components out of all those labs I was talking about, and all those phases of tests. Some of those are going off of sort of a vaccine, kind of a blank vaccine, if you will. Stuff that they can modify quickly, that's very close to what they need. And the COVID style viruses are very common. It's the common cold is a COVID virus. So it's a category that makes sense to look at. So we had been doing this, and we had put money into that Wuhan lab, and among others. The thing is, things can go wrong, and if you're in a third world country or a country that doesn't really care quite as much as maybe we do about containing things in their population, you could have a catastrophe. Is that how this happened? I don't know. No one's really totally determined where this came from yet. We know the location where it started. We know Wuhan, China is ground zero for it, but we don't know how it popped into existence. We have our ideas. It was bats were sort of a category that seemed to make sense. So it's probably going to take some time because like I said, a lot of the documents and all the very early documents were destroyed. China doesn't really want the news to get out. China's been not the best world partner here. But anyway, at the end of the month, at the end of April 29th, our own National Institute of Health, NIH, started pushing remdesivir. Now, remdesivir is touted as a very effective drug at treating COVID patients. It's really expensive. It's well over $2,000 for a whole course. Whereas if you're using some of the earlier, older drugs, you're talking a couple $100. So maybe you start to understand why the hydroxychloroquine was getting a bad rap right there at the end of April, or going through April, and boom, all of a sudden right at the end of April, because we have this new drug, and of course it's patented, and it's always good to realize that Dr. Fauci has a dozen patents at least. The CDC, they own at least 50 patents, mostly patents that you for testing procedures and stuff like that, which of course everyone has to go through in order to have their approval. It's always about the money, right? And there was a lot of money being handed out. You hear billions and trillions. This is crazy, stupid money. Like I said, the Moderna fellow became a billionaire overnight. Bing, obviously it took him a lifetime, and some very talented people working very, very hard to come up with that. But consider that. Like I said, we've got 142 vaccines in preclinical. Every one of those companies, every one of those drugs was funded to the nth degree by the taxpayers. Anyway, let's get into May. May 18th. Moderna found positive antibodies in one of their clinic patients, and they immediately got a 10-year agreement for 1 billion doses. Like I said, so much money. And that's going to be spread out with other companies. I mean, a lot of companies will end up making, I don't know if there's going to be multiple vaccines or if they're going to settle on one. But again, everyone gets paid, And unfortunately, right after that, May 27th, we reached the mark of 100,000 deaths here in the U.S. Now, we know that number's been adjusted. We know that they were accounting for people who died with COVID instead of just people who died because of COVID. And, I think there's an obvious difference between the two, So, if somebody shoots a guy, and he dies because he just got shot in the head, but he just happens to have COVID, he's counted as COVID, as an extreme example. But deaths are higher. I mean, we know there's more people died over the last few months than would normally die. So obviously something's taken them out. But I would argue that the effects of the lockdown and the effects of the collapsing economy and so many other things have probably contributed to that number considerably. Think of all the people who didn't get their checkups that, could have caught that cancer early, or people who just didn't get their cancer treatments, or, you name it, suicides, overdoses, so much, abuse, riots. Anyway, it's extra people died. The virus is as real as can be. For those who have been through it, it's very real. It's a mean one. The more you read about what it seems to do, and they're still trying to determine exactly what in the world happens, because it seems to attack everything in you, but it's kind of random. It has a lasting effect. It takes a long time to months really to get over it, and maybe there's even some permanent damage. Who knows? This is a very, very unusual, very nasty virus, no doubt. But if that weren't bad enough, May 31st is when the George Floyd video came out. Horrified everybody that saw it, no doubt. Was it ultimately police brutality? Now that we know that he probably died from ingesting a huge amount of fentanyl, maybe he died even before that. But it doesn't matter. The cop treated him very poorly. Although watching the long video and all that, you can kind of see how things had escalated. But it wasn't right. We were hoping that cops are going to conduct themselves better than the worst of us, even though they're hardly paid any money. This guy sounds like he'd had some problems before, but to reach the conclusion that was racism is one heck of a stretch. That's not what it looked like to me. But it's this whole thing is morphed into something else, and so the video slowly started to spark these protests, and no doubt people were going a little bit stir crazy, being locked down in their houses and not being able to live their life like usual, and maybe emboldened because of the masks, although you didn't see that many initially with the people. Anyway, people moved to the streets and started protesting. And, that's kind of the American way. That's what we do. We bring attention to things that we think are unfair. But those protests morphed over time as the night got later and later and later. All of a sudden it became violent. And you saw people who didn't really fit the protest. It's like, what's with these weird guys in the black outfits and umbrellas and, the gas masks and all? They don't fit. They don't look like protesters. And then you see the videos of, whoa, these guys are busting windows and throwing rocks and then this protest turned into a riot, and then looting, and then fires, and then you're seeing this start to break out all over the country, right? All these major cities, and it's confusing because again it went from police brutality to racism, which Do we have a problem with that? But is it worse than anywhere else in the world? Is this part of the human condition? I don't know, but I'll tell you what, I don't think setting things on fire and busting out windows and all that's a great way to solve the problem. A protest, sure, let's talk about it. But when you start to tear the town apart, that's not talking about anything. That's breaking laws. If I were to try to do any of that nonsense, I'd be in jail for a very long time. These folks, if they get arrested at all, it seems they walk right out the other door. Obviously, what's going on is this stuff's happening in cities where it's being allowed. And that's a very odd thing. But it's an election year. So, if odd things are going to happen. And I think it's worth mentioning, this is where we step away from COVID and we step into an election year. It's right about the end of April where you start to see that shift, and certainly by the very end of May, it's full blown. With the Floyd video, when that comes out, it's like there's some other element here where people aren't being helpful. I mean, I understand when they're trying to push a drug that they can make more money on because they're all going to make money. Okay, that's greed, but I understand that. But this other push didn't line up, right? It didn't make sense. And then let's move into June from there. Let me get back to the timeline. All right, June 8th, the World Health Organization, our buddies, they said, well, you know what? Actually, the asymptomatic spread is really rare. Well, wow. Because all along we were told, well, the problem is why we have to social distance, wear masks, and all that stuff is you don't know who's got it, right? You don't know who's spreading it. It used to be that the guy over there coughing and hacking away and all that stuff and, has got a fever and all, yeah, he's sick for sure. But in this case, somebody that is perfectly fine, it could be spreading it all over the place. And then, it ends up, not so much. And then, of course, immediately they start to walk that back. Well, I mean, it still is. This is, like I said, this is where we start to get into the really funny business of like, hold it, we're going like, masks, don't worry about it. Masks, you've got to wear them all the time. To, everyone has it, no one has it, or, when the authorities, the experts start to run all over the place doing 180s and stuff like that, it's time to just sort of, okay, next circus, different clowns, because these guys, it's gone to their heads. The authority, the ability to make money, the ability to manipulate people. Okay, back to the timeline. Shortly after that, June 10th, we reached 2 million cases. Now, big number, but we're testing like crazy. And now, of course, we know when we test, let's say I go in there and I test positive. And I don't feel sick, but I tested positive. And I need to go to work, but I think you tested positive. Well, let's see, I'll go back next week and I'll take another test. You're positive. Man, I need to get to work. All right, so I'll go back down there and I'll get tested again. You're negative. Good, I can go to work. Well, you've tested positive twice. Now it's counted as 2. See what I mean? It's like, and then you see a lot of labs start to kind of fudge numbers and all that, like we saw in Florida and other places. This is a real problem. You can't base on the testing because there's so many variables to the information. There's tests that are no good. There's tests that are messed up from some other things. But I mean, how many stories have we heard at this point of people like, well, the line was too long, I had to get to work, so I didn't actually get tested, although I was on the list. And then I receive a phone call or a letter saying, oh, you've tested positive. It's like, I wasn't even tested. We've all heard the stories. I have not verified them, but I hear so many of them. And of course, that's the problem, is you hear so many stories. And so what are you supposed to believe? And I think you can go off of the basic evidence. And that's what this timeline's all about. So let me get back to it. June 11th is, well, I mentioned that, was when we experienced the second wave in South Carolina, right here, Florida, and Arizona. Now, this was interesting because these are the first states to open back up. And, like here on coastal South Carolina, we've had a steady flow of folks from up north since the very beginning of this. New Jersey, New York tags throughout. People have been moving down here. South Carolina is among the top 4 states that people are moving to right now, and Idaho being another one. People are getting out of the cities, get out of Dodge, go somewhere. We've got a good tax situation. It's a nice place. They've been building houses like crazy, and man, they're filling them up. You can't hardly even find a house now, and you would not believe, if you've lived here for, let's say, 10, 20 years, you're astounded at the growth. It's just mind-blowing. And everyone has a New Jersey accent all of a sudden. But people getting out, right? But so the second wave, what caused it? Well, was it a lot of people coming down here? Was it because we were all outside, or was it because we were all expecting a second wave, right? That's what we were told. You're going to have that initial bubble, whatever, the curve. We were all supposed to, smooth that out, right? Flatten the curve so the hospitals weren't overwhelmed. And then after that, once we kind of all came back out and, we'd be more exposed to it again, there'd be a little bump up again, and then it'd level out. That's what we were told in the beginning. That's how this worked. That's what was going on. But that was all built up to be a much bigger deal than it really was. We had a couple of hospitals that were overwhelmed briefly, but they were understaffed. This whole COVID thing had been going on for a long time. A lot of people were let go. A lot of hospitals were down to, minimal occupation. And hospitals, just like a hotel, they got to be full to make money. And so they'd been losing money, then letting people go, or people just, didn't want that job anymore. It's a tough job, especially around something like this. So, like I mentioned, the reporting of the numbers, the labs that every single test was positive, and, instances like in Texas where they got a really small county, but in that county is a jail, and there was suddenly, a virus outbreak in the jail. And so that made the whole county look like, oh, this whole county is spiked. Well, that's actually, and that's a curious thing. If everyone is shut down, right, in the jail, and everyone's checked as they come and go, how does a virus suddenly get in there, Anyway, by June 18th, the World Health Organization ended their hydroxychloroquine study. We're going to show the world, even though at this point everyone's using it. Then the National Institute of Health, our big health body, they ended their trial too. They're like, well, we're not even going to test this anymore because we've got our vaccines coming, we've got a very expensive drug that we can sell you, and that's just fine. Kind of, again, you see where their allegiance lies, right? On the dollar bill. June 29th, right after the WHO and the NIH halted their hydroxychloroquine studies, June 29th, Gilead sets the price of remdesivir at $31.20, $3,120. Like I said, is there any mystery? It's all about that, right? June 30th, the day after that, Fauci comes out and warns us that we could still be looking at 100,000 cases a day. We're going to sell this stuff one way or another. July 7th, the next month, we withdrew from the World Health Organization. Stopped giving them money. Just a week ago or so, August 26th, the CDC updated their charts to start reflecting actual death from COVID, not with COVID. I think I put that picture up. I'll put it up again. It's funny because when you look at the list of all the countries, their timelines of COVID, when it started, when it stopped. Most countries stopped this stuff a while ago. We're still at it. I think Canada, England, there's a few countries, but everyone else is like, okay, moving on. Everyone else has opened up their schools. They're not concerned. Kids aren't wearing masks because, really, it's ridiculous for kids to wear masks. At this date, there's no teacher that's been infected by a student, in the grade school ages. This is really unusual virus. We consider like H1N1, okay, our last big one. We didn't really do much about it. We probably should have, but we didn't, and we got lucky because it just burned out real quick. But that really affected kids more than adults, because adults had some immunity, and kids hadn't. So it was related to something that a lot of us were exposed to if you're an adult. And this is sort of the reverse, because it ends up that maybe part of the reason kids really don't suffer from this virus, it's not that they don't catch it, it's just it doesn't really seem to affect them, is it's very closely related to the common cold. And if you've had a cold recently, or a few, if you're in that kind of environment, you probably already have antibodies to a certain extent, T-bodies, that help fight this off. So, I think at this point, all the evidence I've seen, it really suggests that we should just get back in it. Build up our immunities. There's other stuff coming. Always is. And I don't know why they haven't suggested that. You should be taking your vitamin D. You should stay as healthy as you can. Try to work on your diet, things of that nature. That's the best way to stay healthy, because it's a virus. The virus is going to find you one way or another. You can't really hide from them. But if you're healthy, it'll come and go. It won't really be a big deal. Obviously what we're finding out now is that people with pre-existing conditions are at risk. And we've identified the people that should be very careful, and they should be. But for the rest of us, and especially those of us that have had it already, it's sort of like, man, we just need to get on with it. It's time. It is time. The rest of it's either about money or it's about politics at this point. There's one group that benefits, from the masks and hiding, and you can guess which group that is. And now they're trying to use it as an excuse that, well, we can't vote like we normally would. And that opens up the door to all kinds of fraud. And what that really means is that 600 lawyers that they sent out earlier this year all over the country will be very busy fighting every election result they can in this entire country, and we're going to be in limbo forever. So what we need to do is get back to normal, but even more importantly, vote. Vote in person, or vote, if you have to, get your absentee ballot. And get a thing that beeps at you and tells you to shut up, Craig. So I will. But I hope you have a great day, and thanks for listening. Talk to you later.